Nowadays in video games, the best offense is to have a good defense. Parrying is everywhere, from action and fighting games to now even turn-based games and even first-person shooters. But has parrying gone too far? It's a question that might seem wild to ask, especially coming from me, a self-proclaimed parry poppy. And while it's one of my favorite mechanics in video games, it's worth examining why every game has a parry. Parrying, deflecting, countering, or in other words, hitting a perfectly timed block to special effect is a mechanic that goes back in video games. Soul Calibur was the first time I remember parrying. Fighting games had first dibs on widely adopting the mechanic. You could look toward Evo Moment 37 featuring Daigo versus Justin Wong in Street Fighter 3 Third Strike for a prominent example of why parrying is such a good feature to have. The crowd gets hyped because in those few possible frames that you have available to hit that command, Daigo is able to perfectly time a block to negate damage on each hit being thrown at him, frame perfect. It's exhilarating, a show of skill, and boiled down in even more basic terms, it's sick as hell. Beyond fighting games, action games over the generations have used parrying to varying degrees. I had to crowdsource a bit of info on this one. Shout out to Fallout New Vegas director Josh Sawyer for cluing me into Devil May Cry 3's use of parries in 2005. Games like Batman Arkham and Shadow of Mordor have counters as well, which might be a bit too generous to refer to as parries in the way that we're talking about in this video, but it's worth mentioning. Assassin's Creed's parries, however, got me through many a jam. Were they kind of broken? Yes. Were they the thing that I liked most about that game? Also yes. Parries have been around in a number of action games, but like a lot of how modern action games function, everything changed when From Software decided to cook. Souls games had a parry that elevated the risk-reward factor already inherent to those games. Read an enemy's animation, time your button press, and if it all adds up, stun your enemy for big damage. If you mess it up though, you'll take unnecessary damage that could screw things up for you. Souls' slower, more deliberate pace of combat made the deliberate action of parrying feel like a more conscious risk than ever before. It's a mechanic that works well in the risky framework of Souls games, and From didn't stop there. If they started cooking with Souls, they added sauce with Bloodborne. Bloodborne went as far as to give you a gun to parry. This felt like a special inclusion of the mechanic, an acknowledgement from that parries can be a core ingredient in their combat system and are worth shining a light on in a way that people can't ignore. There is an entire button dedicated to it, and an entire category of weapon dedicated to perfectly timed stuns. Bloodborne was my first From game, and the risk and reward of parrying with a blunderbuss felt right. It made the combat feel novel, cool, and most importantly, it made me consider enemy animations in a whole new way. From Software's slower, deliberate pace leans on its enemy combat design, specifically the animations. Enemies and bosses have combat animations that have a bit more wind up to them, giving players time to read them and make those split-second decisions between hitting a dodge roll or risking a perfectly timed parry for the reward of staggering your enemy. Fighting a From enemy can feel like getting pump faked in NBA Street Volume 2, and then getting impaled. And From's parry isn't about waiting for an icon, flash, or any sort of overt indicator. It's about watching your enemy's arm wind back and then forward for a hit. It's about seeing a creature jump up in the air with its weapons coming down. It's about internalizing the way these NPCs move and dance. It tests you as a player on your knowledge of how well you've been paying attention to patterns, or how naturally you understand action timing. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice recognized and evolved From's interpretation of parrying even further by making it the main entree. Deflecting an enemy's repeated attacks with perfect timing is the combat system of this game. With each deflect, a stagger meter is increased, allowing you to break an enemy's posture for a fatal blow, meaning every enemy combo is not only an animation to anticipate, it's an entire rhythm being taught to the player that the game is teaching you to play back. Sekiro also has varying counters within its system, like the Mikiri counter for thrusts and even a special way to counter lightning. Sekiro is parry the video game. It's a critical darling and honestly up there for me as one of the best action games ever made. So then, if Sekiro in its overabundance of parrying and countering is so good, what's the problem? Well, if parrying was already becoming a regular mechanic, Sekiro might have floored the gas pedal, which on one hand is great because I like Wo Long Fallen Dynasty. I like Liza P. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is great. Stellar Blade is dope. Shoot, I've heard good things about Nine Souls. The first Berserker Kazan is fun. Okay, I'm a little exhausted. If you're an action game in 2025, chances are you have a parry button, which is fine and dandy, but like those bosses that you parry in Sekiro, I'm starting to feel a fatigue. There comes a time in any genre of video games where a new mechanic is introduced or explored in a way that inspires every other developer, like the climbing in Breath of the Wild or the Strand genre. The problem is when those inspirations become a bit of a crutch on a game's design, and in the case of games like Wo Long Fallen Dynasty and the first Berserker Kazan, even though I think these games are good, I can only read the same combat animations over and over and over again until the fun of it runs out. Parrying is meant to feel like a special clutch way to prove mastery over a game's enemies. Oftentimes though, it can feel like an easy way to pull in sickos who just need a hit of the Sekiro joint. Two recent big games have adopted parries as a primary mechanic: Clear Obscure Expedition 33 and Doom the Dark Ages. A turn-based RPG and a Doom, the Dark Ages. I actually think Expedition 33's use of parries is very well done. It's a fun way to get players to engage with the turn-based combat system and adds a layer of attention needed for the combat animations. It also makes the player make in-the-moment decisions between an easier dodge and a more risky parry, and has a special, more extreme parry for good measure. It's a really smart inclusion for a genre that typically doesn't need this type of action, but I think there was a desire to westernize its systems a little bit and appeal to a broader audience, and overall, it works. My one fault with this implementation is that in a turn-based combat system, I've found myself wanting the option to actually learn the enemy animations before testing the parry. It feels a bit worse to get hit in Expedition 33 than say in Elden Ring or Sekiro. I think that's because there's the desire to parry everything, so when you face a new enemy, it can get demoralizing to try and learn on the fly, since in a turn-based scenario, it's a bit more rigid and less forgiving. I wish there was a way to restart battles on the fly akin to Metaphor Refantasio, so I can spend an initial fight learning enemy moves and then the second one executing on parries. As far as Doom the Dark Ages, it gets many of the Doomisms right for the new entry, though the addition of parrying feels weird. I played it mainly on the default Hurt Me Plenty difficulty, which sets its parry windows at a margin so wide I could cook dinner and come back and still land a parry. Not only that, but the game is constantly throwing its green parryable projectiles at you. It's the game's solution to slow this entry down into a stand your ground type of experience as opposed to one focused around mobility like previous Dooms. But it also treats parrying as the go-to function for deflecting back projectiles with a large area of effect to make it work, since managing spatial awareness in first person is kinda tough. The problem here is that there's not much being learned in Doom the Dark Ages about enemy animations, patterns, or anything worth internalizing. The wind-up part of combat animation is often absent. A lot of this is likely accommodating for the fact that this is a first-person shooter, but I think in the process of adapting parries to Doom, the joy of why parrying is fun in the first place is lost a bit. I never felt like a badass hitting the parry button. If anything, halfway through the game, it felt like mindless routine. Just another added element to a combat system to give the player something to do. And I think this is a missed opportunity for how it could have expanded the game's combat system further by building the tension of having a parry turn around a fight or save your run. Parrying has hit critical mass in action games and is now starting to affect a broader array of video game genres. It is in fact becoming the main entree to many combat systems, and I think that's okay, and in many cases fantastic. However, too much of a good thing can dilute the impact of it, and in some cases make me numb to what should make me feel like the coldest of all time. So what I'm saying is that parries aren't meant to be spammed, and if you're spamming the parry, you're doing it wrong.